Hello history lovers. Eleanor here. Tonight, we will embark on a journey. Not across oceans or empires, but into something far more subtle. How the ancient Romans learned to keep cool. Imagine a blazing summer day in southern Italy. The sun fixed in a cloudless sky. Its rays painting every marble column and clay-tiled roof with a golden sheen. But step inside a Roman villa, and the story changes. You're no longer in the grip of the sun. A cool hush meets your skin. Shadows drift across polished stone. Somewhere, faintly, the sound of water echoes. There is stillness. There is thought. And tonight, we're going to uncover the forgotten marvels of ancient climate control. How architects, long before electricity, air conditioning, or even the humble ceiling fan, mastered the art of creating comfort. If you enjoy these journeys through time, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. And do share your favorite overlooked bit of history in the comments. I always love hearing about the corners you've explored. Now, settle in comfortably, close your eyes, and let's travel back in time with Eleanor. When I first learned about Roman architecture, I was too young to appreciate the elegance of it. Back then, I was dazzled by the grandeur. The arches, the domes, the columns carved with battle scenes and imperial pride. But as I grew older, and especially after teaching for decades in classrooms that were either too cold or too hot, I began to admire something more subtle. How deeply Roman builders understood their environment. It wasn't just about beauty. It was about function. And nowhere is that more apparent than in how they handled heat. Picture this. A Roman villa in the hills outside of Rome. It's noon. The sun is at its highest. The fields beyond are hazy with warmth. And the olive trees cast dark, slanting shadows. But step inside the villa's central courtyard, the atrium, and everything changes. The floor beneath your sandals is cool to the touch. The walls breathe faintly. There's a stillness, but not a dead silence. You hear the burble of a small fountain in the center, the trickle of water echoing off stone. Light filters through the compluvium, the open roof above. But it doesn't scorch. It dapples. It's a design that seems so simple. And yet, it's brilliantly engineered. The thick stone walls absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly, like a gentle sigh. At night, the high ceilings allowed warm air to rise. Small windows and carefully placed doorways created controlled cross-ventilation. And the central fountain? Not just decorative. As the water evaporated, it cooled the surrounding air. All without a single fan. In fact, the Romans had no mechanical cooling systems. Their technology was architectural, passive, thoughtful. And they didn't just apply these ideas to grand homes. Even more modest dwellings used variations of these principles. Rooms placed strategically on the north-facing side, covered porticos, and interior courtyards that caught the breeze while blocking the harshest sun. One of my favorite little details comes from a small domus, a middle-class Roman home, in the ruins of Ostia Antica. On the hottest side of the house, the walls were unusually thick. And in that thick wall, a series of narrow vertical channels, carved intentionally to direct airflow from the shaded outer wall into the inner rooms. A primitive form of ventilation shaft. It's astonishing. Really. And it makes me wonder how much of our modern discomfort comes not from the climate itself, but from our detachment from it. The Romans built with the seasons in mind. Their homes shifted with the sun. Their daily rhythms mirrored the patterns of light and heat. They lived with their environment, not against it. And here's something even more striking. This wasn't just practical. It was philosophical. To be cool, to be composed, was a Roman virtue. The Latin word audium referred to the peaceful, reflective state of leisure one might find in a shaded garden or a calm atrium. It was in these spaces, neither hot nor hectic, that ideas were born, poems written, and strategies quietly formed. In a way, Roman architecture didn't just manage heat. It managed the human spirit. One story I love comes from the writings of Pliny the Younger. He described his country villa in such loving detail, mentioning where the sunlight hit his study in the morning, how the breeze passed through the triclinium at dusk, that you begin to realize he wasn't just bragging about luxury. He was describing a way of life shaped by comfort and reflection. He even noted how different rooms served different moods depending on the time of day and direction of the wind. Now that's home design. Historians still debate whether all Roman homes enjoyed these advantages, or if they were limited to the elite. And it's true. Poor tenement buildings, the insulae, were less comfortable, more crowded, and prone to overheating. But even there, architectural knowledge found small footholds. Courtyards were shared. Awnings were hung. Life still bent, however slightly, toward shade and breeze. This makes us wonder. What would it look like to design for comfort first, before convenience? What if we let our buildings breathe again? The Romans had no electricity. Yet they made homes that stayed livable through the Mediterranean summer. They had no air conditioning. Yet they understood the power of water, air, shade, and stone. As I sit now, listening to my old floor fan hum in the corner, I think of those atriums, of the dappled sunlight, of the quiet. And I marvel at how ancient wisdom can still cool the present, if we let it. There's something so poetic, isn't there, about the idea that a building could breathe. That walls, ceilings, and stones could act not just as barriers, but as partners in the rhythm of daily life. That's the feeling I always get when I think about the atrium, one of the most elegant solutions in Roman domestic architecture. If the Roman villa were a living organism, the atrium was its lungs. This central space, open to the sky and surrounded by rooms, was far more than an architectural flourish. It was where life happened, where the family gathered, where guests were welcomed, where the household gods were honored. But most ingeniously, it was a climate strategy that harnessed light, air, and water in perfect balance. The atrium's roof had a rectangular opening, the compluvium, that allowed light to pour in and hot air to rise out. Directly beneath it, in the floor, was a shallow basin called the impluvium, designed to collect rainwater. The effect was both functional and sensory. The air moved gently through the house, cooled by the evaporation from the impluvium. In hot months, it acted like a passive air conditioning unit. I remember visiting a reconstructed Roman villa in southern France. It was a warm spring afternoon, and the sun sat high and golden above the fields. When I stepped into the atrium, it was like walking into a whisper. Cool, dim, peaceful. The kind of quiet you don't notice until you're inside it. What struck me most wasn't just the temperature change, but how natural it all felt. No hum of fans. No artificial breeze. Just architecture doing its ancient work. Silently. The use of atria dates back to early Etruscan homes. But the Romans refined it. In wealthier homes, multiple atria might be included, each serving a different function or mood. And some villas included peristyles. Open garden courtyards surrounded by colonnades, often adorned with fountains and statuary. These were not only aesthetically pleasing, they introduced more air circulation into the heart of the home. And the materials used in these spaces? Chosen with thermal strategy in mind. Floors were often laid in polished stone or terracotta, materials that stayed cool even underfoot. The walls were made of thick masonry, capable of absorbing heat during the day and releasing it slowly at night. Wooden shutters, when closed during midday, kept out the direct sun but allowed filtered air to pass through. Even the paint on the walls mattered. Lighter hues reflected light. Rich reds and ochres, sometimes made from natural earth pigments, created warmth without physical heat. In some cases, frescoes of cool, serene landscapes were painted onto walls, almost as if to psychologically invite a chill into the space. One of the lesser-known features I adore is the tablinum, the room between the atrium and the peristyle garden. It acted as a transition space, often where the head of household worked or received guests. Because of its placement, it benefited from both indirect light and cross breezes. An ancient example of the ideal home office, if you ask me. This room often had wooden or linen curtains that could be drawn or pulled aside, regulating the flow of air and the level of privacy. Such simple tools, yet so finely tuned to the body's comfort. And of course, central to all of this was the Roman relationship with water. The impluvium wasn't just for cooling. It collected rain that was then funneled into cisterns below the house, later used for bathing, washing, and gardening. The sound of water, always present, was itself a balm in the heat. I've long believed that sound plays a hidden role in comfort. Just as the rustle of trees soothes us on summer nights, the Roman villa sang softly through its fountains. There's a charming passage from the poet Martial, who describes a modest villa with a central fountain that mimicked the sound of distant rain. He wrote of enjoying its music while reclining on a couch with wine in hand. The air sweet with garden herbs. Now tell me that doesn't sound like luxury. What's even more compelling is how these design features crossed class lines. While elite homes were grander, many of the principles, atrium ventilation, courtyard-centered design, use of local materials, filtered down to middle-class and even working-class homes. Climate-conscious design wasn't reserved for the elite. It was embedded in the Roman building tradition. And this makes me wonder, how did we forget? In our age of energy grids and humming HVAC systems, we often design buildings first, then retrofit comfort into them. But the Romans began with comfort, using nature itself as a collaborator. And it wasn't just about staying cool. It was about creating spaces that encouraged thoughtfulness. Even the orientation of the atrium mattered. In warmer regions, villas were positioned to catch prevailing breezes, and their most used rooms were placed on the cooler, northern side. It was as if each home had its own compass, tuned not to the stars, but to the wind. One minor historical figure who deserves more attention here is Marcus Vitruvius Pollio, an architect and engineer whose treatise De Architectura remains one of our most valuable sources on Roman design. He wrote extensively about how buildings should be adapted to their climate, topography, and purpose. A villa in Gaul, he argued, should be built differently than one in North Africa. And he was right. His work influenced later thinkers, from Renaissance masters to modern architects. And yet, many of his most practical lessons about airflow and light lie dusty on forgotten shelves. So here's a question worth asking. What might our cities feel like if we remembered to build with the wind again? When I step out into the midday sun and feel heat rise from the pavement like breath from a dragon, I think of those silent atria, of the impluviums catching both light and coolness, of homes that listen to the sun, and responded. And I carried that quiet with me. I've always believed that understanding how a civilization handled extremes, heat, cold, flood, famine, tells you more about their ingenuity than all their temples and triumphal arches combined. And when it comes to thermal mastery, the Romans weren't just good at staying cool. They were pioneers in regulating heat, too. Now, that may seem like a contradiction. This is, after all, a story about staying cool. But here's the secret. In understanding how the Romans warmed their spaces, we can better appreciate how they learned to move, trap, and release heat in ways that eventually helped them stay cool, too. Let's talk about one of Rome's most fascinating architectural inventions: the hypocaust. Even the word feels mysterious. It comes from the Greek hypo, under, and kain, to burn. And it refers to an underfloor heating system that, get this, was entirely passive. A fire was lit in a furnace room, and the hot air flowed through a series of raised floor chambers and hollow wall tiles, warming the floors and, by extension, the rooms above. Think of it like radiant heating. First century style. The brilliance of the hypocaust lies not only in how it delivered warmth, but in what it revealed. Romans understood thermal flow. They knew that hot air rises. They knew how to create channels and vents. And, critically, they knew how to contain or redirect heat based on need. This wasn't just about luxury baths or winter villas, although those certainly benefited. These heating systems were often found in public buildings, military outposts, and even in some middle-class homes. The hypocaust represented an early form of thermal architecture, one that could be turned to either warmth or cooling. How? Well, by controlling where not to let heat collect. Some Roman architects began using the same channel systems, without the furnace, to allow air to circulate under floors and behind walls, especially in hot climates. These air gaps acted like insulation. And in coastal areas, breezes could even be guided through underground corridors to cool entire rooms. There's a villa in Sicily, the Villa Romana del Casal, where you can still walk across the beautifully tiled mosaic floors and imagine the air once flowing quietly beneath. The hypocaust system there is massive, supporting an estate of over 60 rooms. And while most visitors marvel at the art, I find myself staring at the rows of brick piers that once carried air and warmth so silently. This use of subterranean space makes me think of our own modern efforts at sustainability. Cooling with geothermal systems, creating insulated floors or green roofs. The Romans were doing something not so different. Just without machines. It makes you wonder. Did they know how revolutionary they were? There's one lesser-known engineer I always like to introduce to my students. Sextus Julius Frontinus. He's not as famous as Vitruvius, but as a water commissioner for Rome, he was responsible for managing the aqueducts and public baths. He once wrote about the way aqueduct tunnels, when built close to the ground surface, created natural cooling in structures nearby. That's right. They use their plumbing as a cooling mechanism. Just think of that the next time you pass an air conditioning unit humming behind a fence. Even more fascinating is how these systems blended with social rituals. The balnei, public bathhouses, were not just for hygiene. They were community centers, intellectual hubs, relaxation sanctuaries. And central to them were rooms that transitioned in temperature. The caldarium, hot. The tepidarium, warm. And the frigidarium, cold. Now here's where it gets clever. The frigidarium was often built in a way that took advantage of thicker stone walls, limited sunlight, and even north-facing exposure. helping it remain cool naturally. So, in one building, you had a microcosm of climate strategy. Heat controlled, cold preserved, all using architectural layout and the flow of air and water. And these weren't just the luxuries of the elite. In Pompeii, archaeologists uncovered a modest bathhouse with remarkably efficient thermal planning. It even had double walls, which allowed warm or cool air to circulate, adjusting the internal temperature as needed. It's in these details, the alignment of rooms, the angle of a vent, the placement of a water source, that the genius reveals itself. As I think back on the years I spent in old-school buildings with clunky radiators and single-pane windows, I can't help but sigh a little. We had all the modern tools, but so often forgot the principles. This makes me wonder, why do we so often try to overpower the environment rather than collaborate with it? The Romans didn't seek to eliminate heat or cold. They sought to move with it, to use what was already there. And in doing so, they created spaces not just of comfort, but of intention. I sometimes imagine what a Roman architect might say if they walked into a modern home. They'd be amazed by our materials. Certainly. But I think they'd ask, why are your ceilings low? Why don't your walls help you breathe? Why do you trap the sun instead of dancing with it? And those are fair questions. Perhaps that's the real legacy of the Hypocaust. Not the bricks or the fires, but the philosophy behind them. That architecture isn't just shelter. It's a relationship. A response to place and purpose. A way of saying, I see you, sun. I hear you, wind. Let's make something together. And isn't that a beautiful way to live? If you've ever walked through an old Roman city, whether it's the quiet ruins of Ostia Antica or the bustling, tour-filled stones of Pompeii, you'll notice something curious about the buildings. They feel as though they were placed with intention, as if every arch and window knew where the sun would rise, where the wind would blow, and when the heat would come. That's because Roman architecture wasn't only about what they built. It was about where and how they built it. Let's begin with windows. Today, we tend to think of windows as sources of light and air. And sometimes, of frustration when the sun glares in at just the wrong angle. But to the Romans, windows were tools, adjusted and arranged to either embrace or avoid the sun. In warmer regions like North Africa or the southern Italian coast, windows were smaller, set high on the wall, often shuttered or covered with thin sheets of mica or cloth. These let in light but filtered heat. In northern climates, however, you'll find Roman villas with larger south-facing windows, designed to capture the warmth of the sun during the cooler months. They even built seasonal rooms, some meant for summer use, others for winter, each carefully oriented to receive the ideal amount of sun or shade. Then there's the building material itself. We've already touched on stone and terracotta, but the Romans also used concrete. Opus cementitium, a revolutionary mixture that retained heat differently than other materials. They knew that walls made of concrete could be paired with facing stones or stucco to modulate internal temperature. More importantly, they understood that where you placed a wall mattered just as much as what you made it from. Take, for example, the design of the insulae, the Roman apartment buildings. These multi-storied structures were often crowded, but even they were subject to some clever heat-deflecting tricks. The ground floor, usually the coolest, was reserved for shops and merchants. Upper floors, hotter and more exposed, were often rented at a lower cost. People knew height came with heat. Even in these crowded urban environments, Roman builders tried to align buildings with prevailing winds. allowing for natural cross breezes through interior courtyards and open walkways. Streets were arranged in grid patterns. But not just for organization. In warmer cities, streets often ran east-west so that buildings cast shadows on each other during the hottest parts of the day. You see, Roman builders weren't just architects. They were climate strategists. And then there were the roofs. Roofs were sloped to direct water toward the impluvium, as we discussed earlier. But they also played a key role in heat control. In some regions, roofs were double-layered with open-air channels between them to reduce radiant heat transfer. Some buildings even used green roofing techniques, planting herbs or grasses to absorb sun and add insulation. The more you look, the more you realize that every surface, every space, was designed with the sun in mind. One of my favorite surviving examples of this philosophy lies in the ruins of Herculaneum, that lesser-known neighbor to Pompeii. There's a villa there, the House of the Deer, with a wide, open portico that faces west, capturing the golden evening light but remaining shaded by overhanging beams during the heat of the day. Beneath that portico is a mosaic floor so cool, you can almost feel it through time. And just nearby, the remains of a low stone bench, probably placed for sitting at dusk, when the walls had released the heat they'd absorbed all afternoon. Can you imagine that? Designing your home for the evening breeze? That brings me to something subtle, but deeply Roman. How a building felt was just as important as how it looked. They designed for atmosphere, not just aesthetics. Let's take a moment to talk about color. The Romans used color not just for decoration, but to influence temperature perception. Darker tones were used in cooler rooms to absorb sunlight, while lighter pastels, especially in sleeping quarters and summer rooms, were meant to reflect heat and soothe the senses. Some frescoes even depicted cool, misty landscapes, full of gentle greens and watery blues. These weren't just art. They were mental air conditioning. In one room of a villa near Naples, the walls are painted with quiet garden scenes. Pergolas draped in grapevines. Still fountains reflecting the sky. Birds mid-flight. There's no movement in the room, but the painting suggests a breeze. A psychological chill. It's a reminder that the Romans didn't separate comfort from creativity. They understood that what we feel is often shaped by what we see. I remember a summer afternoon years ago, walking through a reconstructed Roman house exhibit with a group of students. The interior had been recreated with stunning accuracy. High ceilings, shaded courtyards, even the scent of rosemary planted in clay pots. One student looked around and whispered, "It's cool in here." And it was. Despite the heat outside, we felt that hush, that careful calibration of space and light. That's the power of design that listens to the world. Historians still debate whether Roman cooling techniques were shared broadly across the empire or remained a southern luxury. But archaeological evidence, from Britain to Syria, shows that the principles traveled, even if the materials changed. This makes us wonder. Have we become too used to battling the elements rather than working with them? The Romans knew that shade could be sacred, that a breeze could be engineered, that warmth and coolness didn't have to come from machines, but from wisdom in brick and stone. And perhaps, in our effort to modernize, we forgot how to pay attention. Today, architects are slowly rediscovering these truths. Passive cooling is making a comeback. Smart buildings are learning to adapt with the sun. But the Romans? They didn't need algorithms. They had instinct, observation, and experience. As the sun sets and the walls around me begin to soften with evening light, I think about all those homes across centuries, still standing, still whispering their lessons in the language of air and stone. And I smile. Because long before we had the science, we had the sensation. And Rome knew how to build for both. Water. The Romans didn't just respect it. They choreographed it. They made it dance in fountains, hum in aqueducts, cool their courtyards, and soothe their senses. If stone was the Roman architect's skeleton, then water was its breath. Soft, flowing, constant. You see, in a world without refrigeration or electric fans, evaporative cooling was the Roman secret weapon. And they mastered it not through theory, but through thousands of years of trial, observation, and adaptation. Let me paint you a scene. Imagine stepping into a Roman villa on a sweltering summer afternoon. The sun outside blazes white against the clay rooftops. Cicadas drone. But inside? Cool. The sound of trickling water greets you even before your eyes adjust. In the center of the atrium, a marble basin. The impluvium collects rain or fresh aqueduct-fed water. Its surface barely ripples, but the air around it is unmistakably fresh. Not cold. No. But cooler than the dry heat outside. This effect wasn't accidental. The Romans understood that as water evaporated, it took heat with it. And by placing fountains or pools in strategic indoor and semi-indoor locations, atriums, peristyles, and garden courtyards, they created zones of passive cooling. But they went even further. In many grand homes, especially those in warmer regions like North Africa or Hispania, the Romans installed channel-fed floor basins. Shallow water channels embedded into the stone floors of public rooms. Water would flow slowly across these narrow lanes, sometimes perfumed with herbs or rose petals, cooling the surrounding air while also filling the space with fragrance and ambience. It's an idea that would later inspire more shrills in Andalusian palaces, and even modern evaporative air systems. And of course, none of this would be possible without one of the greatest feats of Roman engineering: the aqueduct. Oh, how I admire those structures. Graceful yet practical. Elegant yet essential. The aqueducts brought fresh water into cities, often from dozens of miles away, powered purely by gravity. Rome itself was fed by 11 major aqueducts, supplying over 1 million cubic meters of water a day. That water didn't just serve the public baths or fountains. It flowed through hidden channels beneath the streets, into the homes of the wealthy, into the cisterns and cooling systems that made Roman comfort possible. Some villas even had multi-pool systems. Smaller basins leading to larger reflecting pools, where water would warm under the sun during the day and cool rapidly at night, creating subtle air currents in and around the home. Imagine lying beside one on a summer evening. The night breeze carrying the scent of water lilies and stone. That's the kind of cooling you feel in your bones. In the larger public spaces, water served not only a climate function, but a social one. Public fountains, or nymphaea, were gathering points. Places to fill amphorae. Yes. But also to meet neighbors, exchange news, or simply rest in the shade. The coolness of the space invited conversation. Just as modern plazas sometimes revolve around a single, central fountain. One particularly enchanting example still exists in the ruins of Leptis Magna, in modern-day Libya. There, a richly decorated fountain once stood at the heart of the Roman square, shaded by colonnades, surrounded by benches, and cooled by cascading water. The architecture around it framed the fountain like a stage, drawing both breezes and people inward. And here's the subtle genius. These spaces weren't just built for now. They were designed to change throughout the day. Fountains were shaded in the morning. Basins caught the sun at noon. Pools reflected the moon at night. Time itself moved through water. Even gardens were part of the cooling plan. The Romans were among the first to integrate horticulture into climate control. Shrubs and vines were placed near walls to absorb and deflect heat. Pergolas shaded walkways. Cypress trees, with their narrow trunks and thick foliage, were planted along breezeways to funnel air. The hortus, the domestic garden, wasn't just for beauty or food. It was an ambient cooling system, wrapping homes in shade, scent, and serenity. One lesser-known figure who advanced this kind of thinking was Lucius Licinius Lucullus, a Roman general better known today for his extravagant feasts. But in his retirement, he became something of a gardening philosopher. His seaside villas were filled with reflective pools, shaded groves, and water-fed microclimates. Some ancient writers called him mad for spending so much on gardens. Others called him a genius. And perhaps he was both. Because Lucullus understood, long before we coined terms like green architecture, that nature and comfort weren't enemies. They were partners. Water and wind could be shaped by stone and vine. This makes me wonder, how many of our own public spaces have forgotten that lesson? We build fountains for show, but rarely for flow. We lay concrete instead of soil. We built glass towers in sun-drenched cities without a single tree for miles. And then we wonder why we feel so hot, so disconnected. I remember one summer, walking through a new urban plaza with no shade, no greenery, no sound of water. The heat rose from the ground like breath from a furnace. People hurried. No one lingered. And I thought, even the Romans would have known better. They would have listened for the breeze. They would have planted shade. They would have let the water speak. Because to them, coolness was never just about survival. It was about pleasure. About reflection. About making space for the soul to rest. As I sip my evening tea and listen to the low hum of my neighbor's sprinkler, I hear echoes of those Roman fountains. And I think, maybe the key to comfort isn't adding more tech. Maybe it's remembering what comfort used to be. The sound of water in a quiet courtyard. The scent of herbs in the dusk air. And the miracle of a breeze that finds you just when you need it. There's a Roman phrase I've always loved. Sub umbra porticus. In the shade of the colonnade. It's more than a description. It's a feeling. A memory of stepping off a sun-drenched street and into that long, columned shadow. Cool stone beneath your feet. Air shifting gently across your face. The hush of conversation or the echo of sandals clicking faintly. You've arrived in the space between sun and silence. To truly understand how the Romans kept cool, we must look at something so deceptively simple it's often overlooked. Shade. Now, shade might not seem like an invention. But in the Roman world, shade was engineered, designed, honored. The colonnade, or portico, was one of the most widespread and beloved features in Roman architecture. It wasn't just a place to walk. It was a passive cooling structure. These long rows of columns supported roofs that cast predictable, rhythmic shadows across open spaces, courtyards, walkways, and even marketplaces. And the beauty was in the timing. The depth of the portico created seasonal comfort. In summer, when the sun was high and fierce, the portico's shadow stretched far and deep. In winter, when the sun dipped lower in the sky, its rays could reach further in, warming the interior surfaces. It's a perfect example of what today we call solar geometry. But of course, the Romans didn't call it that. They just called it wisdom. You'll find porticos everywhere in Roman life. From grand forums to humble homes. From city temples to rural baths. They weren't merely decorations. They were the skeletal arms of the city, embracing its people with shelter and grace. And then there were the courtyards. The Roman peristyle garden, a square or rectangular open space surrounded by columns and sometimes covered walkways, was as much about air as it was about beauty. These courtyards served as natural ventilators, channeling breezes through adjacent rooms, providing visual coolness through greenery and water, and offering refuge from the sun. In the Grand Domus Aurea, Nero's extravagant palace, courtyards were designed with mosaics and marble that reflected light softly, not harshly, and pathways that curved gently around shaded zones of trees and pools. Even the decadent understood that coolness wasn't a luxury. It was an experience to be cultivated. And yet, even in the most modest Roman homes, you'd often find a simple covered walkway or vine-draped arbor. A space where someone might take their lunch in the midday lull, or a child might nap in a shaded patch of floor. I once stood in the ruins of a villa outside Nîmes, in southern France, and watched the shadows of broken columns stretch across the ground as the sun moved behind them. It was quiet. The kind of quiet that carries centuries. And I thought of all the people who had paused in that very shade. Thinking. Praying. Eating. Resting. Surviving the heat. Not by fleeing it, but by living around it. There's something deeply Roman in that. Now, let's talk for a moment about awnings and canopies. Yes, they had them. The famous filarium that covered the Colosseum was a massive, sail-like canopy, operated by an expert crew of sailors who adjusted its angle and tension with ropes and pulleys to shade spectators from the sun. And that same principle, simple fabric stretched over wood or rope, was used in markets, atria, public baths, and even private gardens. Linen, dyed in soft earth tones, often perfumed with oils, fluttered gently in the breeze, creating moving shadows that soothed the senses. These portable forms of shade remind me of the middle space the Romans often occupied. Not quite indoors. Not quite out. They mastered the art of thresholds. The places where light faded gently. Where heat gave way to hush. Even their clothing reflected this logic. Togas and tunics were made of breathable materials, often layered and wrapped loosely, allowing heat to escape and air to circulate. Shade wasn't just architectural. It was woven into lifestyle. And here's something fascinating. Shade was not just physical. It was also social. In Roman cities, certain shaded walkways were reserved for philosophers, students, magistrates. The portico wasn't just a refuge from heat. It was a space for discourse. One might step into the shade not just to cool the body, but to elevate the mind. One lesser-known Roman philosopher, Musonius Rufus, often taught his students beneath a shaded arbor outside the city. He believed that true wisdom required physical ease. That a body at rest opened the way for a mind to reflect. This makes me wonder. What have we lost by retreating indoors entirely? By giving up on transitional spaces in favor of sealed rooms with climate control? I think often of the shaded verandas of my childhood. The way we sat outside with iced tea and the paper fan fluttering in one hand. Not quite inside. Not quite out. The stories shared there. The dreams. The naps. The Romans lived like that. At the edge of sunlight. Always in conversation with it. And today? We build glass buildings that glare. Asphalt that scorches. We remove the trees for wider streets. We enclose everything and then battle the heat we ourselves have invited in. The Romans remind us that shade is not absence. It's architecture. It's care. It's noticing where the sun will be. And preparing a space for when it arrives. And so, The next time you walk through a garden or a plaza and find a columned shadow or a leafy roof above your head, take a breath. Let it cool you. Let it slow you. Because under that shade, you join a long, quiet tradition. A tradition of people who knew how to build with light. Not to banish it, but to guide it. To soften its touch. And in that stillness, that dim and dappled grace, you may just find a little bit of Rome. When I think of the Roman city, not just as it existed in history, but as it must have felt, the first word that comes to mind isn't grand or opulent or even orderly. It's breezy. Strange. Perhaps. For a place of stone and smoke. But Roman cities, at least the ones designed with care, were built for air. Not the kind of artificial current we know from our air conditioners, but something quieter, older. A natural airflow, carried through streets and courtyards, encouraged by placement, by layout, by the whispering logic of space. Let's walk together for a moment, shall we? Imagine standing in the middle of a Roman city like Timgad in modern-day Algeria. The streets are laid out in a perfect grid. Cardo running north-south. Decumanus running east-west. At midday, sunlight slices down those corridors in sharp, bright lines. But around you, the city doesn't feel suffocating. There's a breeze moving gently between the buildings, drawn by orientation, by geometry, by intention. That's no accident. Roman urban planners understood something we often forget in the era of airtight skyscrapers. Wind matters. When designing towns, particularly those in hot or dry climates, Roman engineers would orient major thoroughfares to align with prevailing wind patterns. This allowed air to funnel through streets, around porticos, and into open buildings. Homes weren't built in isolation. They participated in the city's breath. Even the height of buildings played a role. Taller structures cast longer shadows across roads, keeping stone walkways cooler and reducing radiant heat. This effect was especially valuable in the insulae, the multi-story apartment blocks that housed the working class. By aligning and spacing these buildings strategically, they created ventilation corridors, even in densely packed areas. I remember reading once that Roman engineers often used smoke tests. Yes, smoke. To study airflow when designing both bath complexes and open-air theaters. They would release thin wisps into a model space and watch how it moved. And from that observation came design. It's almost poetic, isn't it? To watch the invisible dance of air before you set your stones in place. And the public buildings themselves. Basilicas, markets, temples, were not only oriented for sun and spectacle, but for air movement. High ceilings, open doorways, arcades, all of it served a climatic purpose. There's one remarkable example in Ephesus, a Roman city in present-day Turkey. The Library of Celsus, with its iconic facade, was oriented so that the reading room stayed shaded and caught the afternoon breezes, making it a comfortable space for scholars and scribes even in the summer heat. Some believe that underground channels helped guide cooler air up through floor vents. An ancient cool zone for books and thoughts. And as I mentioned earlier, gardens played a vital role. In public forums or private villas, rows of trees, especially cypress and plane, weren't chosen merely for beauty. Their shape and placement helped direct airflow, creating whisper lanes where wind could move unimpeded, cooled by shaded soil and flowing water. One of my favorite lesser-known examples comes from Caerleon, a Roman settlement in Wales. Despite its more northern, damp climate, the local Principia, or administrative headquarters, was designed with an inner courtyard open to the prevailing western winds. On warmer days, The structure funneled fresh air inward, clearing out musty interiors and refreshing tired workers. Even the cold, gray sky was met with gentle circulation. It reminds me of the old wooden schoolhouses I taught in when I first started. No air conditioning, just high windows, open transoms, and a belief that the building could regulate itself. I didn't appreciate it at the time. I wanted a fan. But now? I see the wisdom. This makes us wonder. What if airflow were considered a human right, not an afterthought? What if city grids, apartment blocks, and public plazas were planned not just for efficiency or aesthetics, but for the soulful necessity of breeze? The Romans thought about these things. Vitruvius, the ever-present voice of Roman architectural wisdom, devoted pages of his writings to the importance of city orientation, the dangers of stagnant air, and the value of harmonizing with the natural elements. He believed that health, civic virtue, and even mood could be influenced by the way air moved through a place. And I believe he was right. Because air, after all, is not just physical. It's psychological. A still room can feel heavy, burdensome, anxious. But a space with good circulation feels alive, hopeful, capable of change. I once had a student, a quiet boy who rarely spoke, tell me after class that his favorite place to do homework was a bench beneath a breezeway at the back of the library. I don't know why, he said, but it makes me think better. I smiled and said, it's because the building is breathing. The Romans would have smiled too. Their cities weren't just networks of stone. They were organs, designed to inhale and exhale, to offer respite and rhythm. And as I look out my window now, watching the trees move softly in the wind, I wonder what my own home might be whispering. What lessons I've forgotten to hear. Because in a Roman city, the wind always had a path. And in following it, the people found peace. I remember the first time I opened De Architectura, Vitruvius' 10 books on architecture. It was an old translation, worn and annotated by several hands before mine. The pages had a comforting weight to them, as if they knew they had survived centuries for a reason. Somewhere near the spine, smudged in pencil, someone had written, "Read like you're listening to wind." And so I did. Vitruvius wasn't just a builder. He was a philosopher of structure, a student of air, space, proportion, and soul. To him, architecture was not merely about shelter. It was about well-being, about designing harmony into walls and thresholds, about building cities that could breathe and humans who could flourish inside them. His thoughts on climate are some of the earliest written theories of environmental design, even if they didn't use that name. In his own words, the healthfulness of a city depends upon the right direction of the winds. He cautioned against placing cities in areas where winds might stagnate, breed illness, or chill the bones unnecessarily. Instead, he advocated building with the wind, not against it. One passage I always return to is his description of how different orientations affect different rooms in a house. The bedrooms should face the morning sun, to greet the day gently. Libraries and studies should open northward, where the light remains steady and cool. Kitchens and baths, let them bask in the southern warmth. It was a choreography of function and light, a quiet ballet of comfort. He even suggested digging small test pits before laying the foundations of a city, placing lit fires inside them, and watching how the smoke behaved. If it swirled violently or refused to rise, the air might be foul or sluggish. But if it danced straight upward, you had found a site fit for building. Isn't that something? Choosing where to settle not by conquest, but by how smoke moves. Vitruvius also emphasized building materials. He argued that porous stone walls, especially tufa and travertine, allowed a structure to regulate its internal temperature naturally. These stones absorbed the coolness of the night and released it slowly during the heat of day. It was passive climate control. No gadgets. Just geology and patience. I once had the chance to visit the remnants of a domus, an elite Roman home, in the ruins of Ostia Antica. Its floors were still patterned in beautiful black and white mosaics, and the remains of the walls had long since crumbled into soft ochre dust. But I remember how the layout mirrored Vitruvius' prescriptions. A central atrium, flanked by symmetrical wings, each opening toward a tiny peristyle garden. Even centuries later, the space felt peaceful, balanced, like it had once been a good place to think. Of course, Vitruvius was not perfect. Some of his theories seem quaint to us now. His obsession with bodily proportion, or his belief that architecture had moral implications based on symmetry alone. But in his climate-conscious thinking, he was visionary. He knew that buildings were not merely enclosures. They were instruments, finely tuned to the human experience. They could either muffle or amplify health. They could invite reflection, or sow restlessness. One of my favorite lesser-known stories about Vitruvius involves Emperor Augustus himself. According to tradition, Vitruvius presented his architectural treatise directly to Augustus, offering it as a guide not just for building structures, but for building an empire of well-being. Imagine handing a ruler a book and saying, "This is how you care for your people." I sometimes wonder, would a modern leader take such a gift seriously? Would a mayor or president today sit down and read about atriums and wind channels in the shape of ideal libraries? Perhaps not. But perhaps they should. Because Vitruvius's world wasn't about technology. It was about respect. For materials. For sunlight. For wind and water and silence. And that kind of reverence doesn't age. Now, there is a curious detail that scholars still debate. Some argue that Vitruvius was not a practicing architect at all, but a theorist. A writer who saw more clearly on paper than in stone. Others believe he was involved in actual construction, though few buildings are directly attributed to him. I find the mystery delightful, because in the end, his greatest construction may not have been physical at all. It was conceptual. A framework. A blueprint for thoughtful living. And in that, he succeeded more than any colonnade or vault could ever convey. Even today, modern sustainable architects cite him. His ideas resonate with passive solar design, thermal mass, natural ventilation. In a world desperate for climate solutions, we are, at last, listening again to the man who tested wind with smoke and light with instinct. And as I sit here, cup of tea in hand, the breeze nudging my curtains just so, I can't help but smile. Because architecture, you see, is a quiet teacher. And Vitruvius? He was one of its wisest voices. He didn't shout. He whispered. Through stone. Through proportion. Through air. And sometimes, through the hands of an old woman, flipping carefully through the fragile pages of a book left on a library shelf. Half forgotten. Until now. I've always been fascinated by the Roman baths. Not just for their grandeur, but for their precision. Most people imagine them as social clubs. Perhaps a bit decadent. Marble columns. Echoes of laughter. Glistening pools. And they were that. But they were also machines of temperature. Symphonies of air, water, and stone working in harmony to balance the body's warmth and cool. Bathhouses were more than places to clean. They were wellness centers, community forums, even libraries. And perhaps most interesting of all, they were masterpieces of thermal control. Take the caldarium, for instance, the hottest room in the sequence. It was a marvel of Roman engineering, built above a hypocaust, the underfloor heating system I touched on earlier. But here, the system was supercharged. Slaves fed fires in the prefernium, and the hot air would flow beneath raised marble floors and into the walls through hollow terracotta flues. The result? A room so evenly heated that one could lie back on a stone bench and feel warmth seep into the very bones. Yet no one lingered in the caldarium too long. After sweating and soaking, bathers would move into the tepidarium, the warm room. This was the heart of the bathhouse. It held a moderate temperature, a gentle embrace after the intense heat. It's where conversation flowed easiest, where massages and anointments with scented oils took place, where the body adjusted. Not shocked, not chilled. Then, finally, came the frigidarium. Cold, invigorating, often with a plunge pool. Here, pores tightened, muscles refreshed, blood raced again. This sequence wasn't just indulgent. It was medically informed. Roman doctors believed in balancing the body's humors, and temperature played a crucial role. The baths offered a kind of ritual reset. And in that entire ritual, every degree mattered. I once visited the ruins of the baths of Caracalla in Rome. The scale alone is overwhelming. Vaulted ceilings, vast mosaics, niches where statues once stood. But what struck me most was the layout. You could trace the path of the bather, room by room. And in the very stones, you could still feel the transitions. Where steam once clung to skin, where cool marble once shocked the senses. What's more remarkable is that this precise temperature choreography extended even to the water systems. The Romans used aqueducts not only to bring in fresh water but also to regulate it. Cisterns warmed by sun could feed the caldarium. Cold springs were tapped for the frigidarium. Everything was connected. Water, air, fire. The elements conspired to soothe. One lesser-known story I adore comes from the small town of Baiae, once considered the Riviera of the Roman elite. Nestled on volcanic land, the town had natural hot springs, which the Romans cleverly incorporated into their bathhouses. They even used the underground steam vents, fumaroles, as part of the heating systems. So efficient was their use of geothermal energy that modern engineers studying the ruins have marveled at their understanding of insulation, draft control, and sustainable use. Imagine green energy in the 1st century. There's something deeply moving about that, isn't there? That long before climate crises, before electricity and air conditioning, humans looked to the earth itself for answers. They didn't always conquer nature. Sometimes, they partnered with it. I sometimes think of my childhood summers, when air conditioning wasn't as common. We had one unit for the whole house, and it was in the living room. The rest of the time, we relied on fans, open windows, and shaded porches. My grandmother used to hang wet sheets over the window screens to cool the air. We'd sit quietly at midday. The house darkened. Conserving energy. Conserving effort. In a strange way, those moments remind me of the tepidarium. A pause. A temperate stillness. Back to Rome. There's a curious architectural detail often overlooked. The suspensory. These were the small pillars, often made of brick, that held up the raised floors in hypocaust rooms. The spaces between them allowed hot air to circulate beneath the room. But over time, they became more than function. They were a signature. Their shapes, sizes, and arrangements varied by region and period. And archaeologists can now sometimes identify which engineer built a bathhouse by the suspensory alone. Isn't that delightful? A kind of stone fingerprint left beneath your feet. And what of the people who built these systems? The engineers, architects, and laborers who worked in smoke-filled tunnels, aligning bricks so perfectly that centuries later, the system still makes sense? Their names are mostly lost. We have the emperors' names, the philosophers, the generals. But the builders, the makers of cool, they remain anonymous. And yet, we feel their choices every time we walk the ruins. Every time we read Vitruvius or feel the preserved airflow in a forgotten hall. I wonder what it meant to them. Those craftsmen. Did they understand they were shaping not just stone but experience? That they were creating rhythm. Hot. Warm. Cold. Release. Balance. Renewal? Or did they simply labor in the dust, hoping for shade? Either way, they gave us something enduring. And in a world where comfort is often loud, blaring vents, humming machines, I find peace in remembering that once, long ago, quiet warmth and quiet coolness were crafted not by force, but by design. Not far from the slopes of Vesuvius lies a place where time quite literally stood still. Pompeii. I first visited as a younger woman, armed with a notebook and the kind of romanticized notions only a history teacher can carry. But nothing prepared me for the quiet there. Not silence. Exactly. But the hush of a city mid-breath. A bowl left on a table. A sandal by a doorway. A dog, still curled as though sleeping. All stilled by ash. By heat. By history. And within these preserved walls, you find homes. Not palaces or grand baths, but the dwellings of ordinary Romans. And in those dwellings, traces of how they lived, and how they kept cool. It's humbling, you know, to walk through a small domus and recognize things. Not just furniture outlines or kitchen tools, but intentional design. The coolness of the impluvium. That central pool in the atrium used to collect rainwater. The way the walls were painted in deeper, richer reds to absorb less glare. The breeze-catching courtyards. The thoughtful orientation of windows, often high and small, to let in light but not heat. Pompeii gives us one of the clearest pictures of Roman residential cooling. And in many cases, the techniques were simple, but astonishingly effective. For instance, some homes had double wall construction. Between the inner and outer walls, builders left narrow gaps. A kind of primitive insulation. It's not unlike how we construct modern walls with insulating materials between drywall and brick. Yet here they were, over 2,000 years ago, crafting temperature buffers out of ingenuity. Many villas included marble flooring or terracotta tiles. Materials that retained coolness and were pleasant underfoot. Especially in the Mediterranean heat. Families would often lie on the floor at midday, just to feel the stone's lingering chill from the night before. And oh, the gardens. Small, shaded horty, with fig trees or laurel. Sometimes even grapevines trained to form leafy awnings. These weren't just for beauty. They cooled the surrounding air, added moisture, and, most cleverly, helped regulate light. I remember stepping into one of those gardens. Sunlight dappling the ground. Cicadas humming. And thinking, this feels like stepping into a whisper. And it wasn't just the wealthy. Even Insulae, the Roman apartment blocks, employed cooling methods. Lower floors were cooler, and thus more expensive, while upper levels bore the brunt of heat. Balconies were often shaded by awnings made of linen or reed mats. Residents used ceramic jugs filled with water, placed near windows, to cool incoming breezes. The evaporation created a subtle draft. If you've ever stood by a lake in summer and felt that faint coolness, you understand the principle. One of my favorite stories is from a humble tavern in Pompeii, where archaeologists found remnants of a large clay jar, positioned strategically beneath an open vent. It seems the owner understood how to funnel cool air across wine amphorae, keeping them pleasantly chilled for the customers. A kind of ancient air conditioning for drinkers. It makes you pause, doesn't it? How practical knowledge, developed through experience and passed by touch and memory, can rival the best modern textbooks. These weren't engineers with degrees. They were builders, homemakers, merchants, adapting, observing, adjusting. I sometimes wonder how much knowledge we lose in the rush forward. How many quiet innovations disappear, not with fire or ash, but with forgetfulness. Even in Pompeii, as I trace my fingers across a sun-warmed wall, I imagined a woman, perhaps like myself, carrying a jug, adjusting a curtain to shield her baby from the heat, humming some old Roman lullaby, not thinking of history, just life. And yet, here she is, 2,000 years later, whispering through plaster and stone, through a shaded atrium and a cleverly placed window, preserving comfort. Of all things, there's a certain tenderness in that, don't you think? When we speak of ancient civilizations, we often talk about conquest, about empire, about grandeur. But what about comfort? What about the everyday wisdom of staying cool, staying calm, staying well? The Romans, through all their expansion and excess, were deeply aware of environment. Their cities were not just statements of power, but carefully tuned ecosystems. Air, water, stone working together to make life bearable, even beautiful. And Pompeii, frozen as it is, remains one of our greatest classrooms. Even now, decades after that first visit, I can still recall the feel of cool marble beneath my sandals, the hush of enclosed gardens, the way light filtered through aged openings, and somewhere in the distance, the outline of Vesuvius, timeless and still. Perhaps the greatest legacy of Roman architecture is not just the temples or aqueducts, but this: that in moments of great heat, great pressure, and yes, even catastrophe, there was a pause. A place designed for quiet, for breath, for balance. And that is what they left behind. When I first visited southern Spain many years ago, I remember walking into the Alhambra just as the afternoon sun softened into amber. The coolness inside hit me instantly, like a breath from another world. I remember pressing my hand to the stone wall, marveling not only at the intricate carvings but at how the structure seemed to breathe, to sip the heat out of the air like an old magician drawing in smoke. What I didn't know then, but later came to cherish, is that many of the principles that made Moorish architecture so astonishing were inherited, at least in part, from the Romans. As Roman influence spread through the Iberian Peninsula, so too did their innovations. Baths, aqueducts, colonnades, and domus floor plans all left their mark. But it was the Moorish architects, centuries later, who reawakened and elevated these cooling traditions, blending them with desert knowledge and Islamic design philosophy into something breathtaking. Where Roman villas had atriums, Moorish palaces had courtyards filled with water and shade. But more than that, they had harmony. The kind of design where every element, geometry, airflow, sound, was meant to soothe. Consider the muqarnas, The stalactite-like ceiling carvings you find in palaces like the Alhambra. Beyond their beauty, they help break up sound and disperse heat, creating acoustic and thermal comfort in rooms that might otherwise bake under the sun. Or the use of clay tiles and latticed screens, called mashrabiyah, which filtered both light and hot air. These were not merely decorative. They were strategic. One example always stays with me. The Court of the Lions, where a marble fountain sits at the center, surrounded by slender columns and arched walkways. The water isn't just ornamental. It's cooling. It flows through channels that run alongside rooms, subtly lowering the ambient temperature. The sound of water becomes a presence. Soft, constant, like a lullaby for the walls themselves. I once stood there, closed my eyes, and imagined the architects at work. Not just thinking in terms of walls and roofs, but in currents. How does heat move? How can stone deflect it? How can air be coaxed into dance? In many ways, these innovations were a spiritual continuation of the Roman mindset. Design is a dialogue with the environment. But the Moors added something more. A poetic intentionally. Every courtyard, every fountain, every breeze seemed to whisper, "We understand the sun, and we welcome its challenge." And that challenge was very real. Southern Spain, much like North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean, bakes in the summer. But inside these buildings, thick walls, high ceilings, and carefully placed vents worked like a symphony. Hot air rose and escaped. Cool air sank and lingered. People moved through shaded arcades and gardens without needing so much as a hand fan. It's worth noting that these designs weren't limited to palaces. Even ordinary homes in Córdoba and Seville carried these traditions. Patios at the center, shaded by trees and watered daily to cool the surrounding air. Flower pots lined the walls not just for beauty, but for their ability to moisturize the microclimate. A simple trick, still used today. It makes one wonder, how did they keep this wisdom alive while so much of Europe forgot? Perhaps it's because the Islamic world, during the Middle Ages, preserved and translated many Roman and Greek texts, keeping alive ideas that were lost elsewhere. Vitruvius, whose writings influenced Roman architecture, was studied and respected. And from those seeds, something new blossomed. Or perhaps it's because living in balance with the environment was never a luxury. It was essential. In desert-adjacent climates, you either learn to live with heat or you perish beneath it. I think often about the quiet genius of those builders. How they worked with what they had. Stone, water, wood, wind. No electricity. No artificial air conditioning. Just design. Refined by necessity and observation. We often call it ancient wisdom, but to them, it was just life. It reminds me of something I once read in a letter from a 12th century Andalusian scholar. The wise man listens not just to the words of others, but to the breath of the earth beneath him. Now, centuries later, architects and climate scientists are circling back to these principles. Terms like passive cooling and bioclimatic architecture are popular once more. But the roots? Oh, they go deep. Past the domes of Granada and the aqueducts of Segovia. Back to Roman arches and shaded porticos. Back to people who walked in sandals, looked up at a punishing sun, and said, "We will not fight you. We will outthink you." There is something quietly noble in that. So when you next feel a breeze through a shaded alley or step into a courtyard that smells of stone and rosemary, think of them. The Roman engineers and the Moorish craftsmen. Whispering across centuries. Not in conquest or monument, but in coolness. In comfort. They remind us, gently, That brilliance doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it hums through a tiled corridor, over water, beneath leaves, waiting for us to pause and notice. It's a curious thing, isn't it? How something as practical as staying cool, how to survive the heat, can be treated with such reverence and artistry in one era, and then forgotten almost entirely in another. After the fall of the Roman Empire, much of Europe seemed to lose touch with that deep, elegant understanding of environment and structure. The knowledge wasn't destroyed outright. It simply faded, replaced by other urgencies, other fears. The Middle Ages weren't as dark as we sometimes like to think. But when it came to climate control, much of the innovation that had once defined Roman and Moorish spaces was lost or severely diminished. The grand hypocausts fell silent. The airy atriums and breezy courtyards gave way to cramped stone halls with small windows and thick tapestries. Castles were built for defense, not comfort. Churches soared, but homes huddled. Of course, there were exceptions. Monasteries in southern France and parts of Italy still clung to old Roman layouts. Some abbeys, particularly those with scholars or Mediterranean influence, preserved fragments of the ancient designs. But for the most part, the cooling elegance of Roman architecture slipped quietly into the shadows of European consciousness. And I sometimes wonder, how do we lose something so useful? Perhaps it's because climate itself changed. The Little Ice Age, a period of cooler temperatures that began in the late Middle Ages, may have made those cooling systems seem less urgent. When you're fighting frost and famine, the last thing on your mind is airflow design. Instead, warmth became the priority, and with it came the rise of the hearth and the fireplace. The medieval mind, shaped by religious doctrine and survivalism, focused more on the next world than this one. Architecture reflected that mindset. Functional, hierarchical, and often austere. Buildings were about protection, symbolism, and the assertion of power. Comfort was a luxury, and cooling, perhaps even seen as indulgent, or worse, wasteful. By the time of the Gothic cathedrals, architectural attention had shifted skyward. Spires stretched toward heaven. Light filtered through stained glass, not through shaded porticos. And the principles of climate-sensitive design, once instinctive to Roman and Moorish builders, became something exotic, foreign, even suspicious. But as we know, knowledge rarely disappears entirely. It burrows. It waited in the scrolls tucked into monasteries. It lingered in the oral traditions of craftsmen. It traveled with traders and scholars who crossed the Mediterranean and brought back stories. Not just of spices and silks, but of how the homes in Damascus or Cairo stayed cool while Europe sweated in wool. And then, like all things that have slumbered too long, it began to stir again. One of the most touching stories I know about this reawakening comes from a quiet corner of 14th century Florence. A stonemason, anonymous now, had spent a winter repairing an old Roman bathhouse, long abandoned. He noticed something peculiar. The way the floors were raised on short pillars. The strange remnants of what looked like flues or vents. He didn't have the words for it, but he copied the idea. When he helped design a merchant's home years later, he incorporated a series of stone ducts that helped warm air circulate beneath the floor. It wasn't exactly cooling, but it was memory. A borrowed instinct. A whisper of Rome echoing through Tuscan stone. It's humbling, really, how often progress is not a straight line but a spiral. Ideas are born, flourish, wither, and then bloom again. Sometimes centuries later. Under different skies. In different languages. And yet, there's something tender in the fact that these old ways were never fully erased. Just paused. Hidden in plain sight. When I taught ancient history to my students, I often asked them, if the Romans could control indoor temperature with nothing but geometry, stone, and sunlight, what's stopping us? That question lingered in their minds. And I dare say, it lingers in mine. Even now. Because today, we often think of innovation as something new, something digital, something buzzing. But what if real brilliance is simply remembering what once worked? Before wires, before vents, before the hum of electricity filled our ears. Sometimes, I imagine a Roman architect standing quietly in the corner of a modern city apartment, watching us fiddle with thermostats and fans, watching us struggle to seal our double-glazed windows. Would they shake their head and smile? Or would they gently whisper, "You've built tall. Now remember to build wise." That's the thing about forgotten knowledge. It's not gone. It waits for us to become curious again. And that curiosity? It's the thread that connects us. Not just to the past, but to the future. As we continue our journey, let's hold on to that thought. That buried in every stone, in every ruined villa or quiet courtyard, there may still be lessons whispering. Lessons not of conquest or empire, but of living well. Of listening to the earth and the wind. And designing. Not just for beauty or power, but for peace. When the Renaissance arrived, it was as if someone opened a long-forgotten chest in the attic. Dust billowing. Gold gleaming faintly beneath cobwebs. And in that chest, among the sculpted bodies and rediscovered texts, lay the architectural wisdom of Rome, waiting to be read again. The revival was uneven. Of course. It began with curiosity, not necessity. Artists like Leonardo da Vinci and architects like Leon Battista Alberti pored over the pages of Vitruvius. Yes. Our dear Vitruvius again. Whose De Architectura had been preserved like a seed in winter. Alberti's own treatise, the Reedificatoria, would become one of the cornerstones of Renaissance architecture, reintroducing the idea that buildings were not just shelters, but reflections of harmony, proportion, and yes, climate. By the 15th century, the Mediterranean heat still baked the plazas and piazzas of Florence and Rome. But minds were awakening. Architects began to design with both form and function again. Sunlight was directed. Walls thickened or hollowed depending on orientation. And porticos reappeared not just as aesthetic gestures, but as deliberate tools of shade. What makes this revival so fascinating is not just that the knowledge returned, but how it returned. It didn't arrive like a lightning bolt. It emerged as a whisper, woven into frescoes, cloisters, and scholarly letters. One Florentine noble commissioned a villa based on ancient ideals of symmetry and light. In the blueprints, one finds a loggia perfectly angled to catch the morning breeze but not the afternoon blaze. In Venice, facing the Adriatic's humid breath, builders designed upper stories with high ceilings and tall windows. Features that echoed ancient Roman apartments known as insulae. And in the city of Padua, where I once spent a quiet summer teaching, a small university courtyard bore a curious resemblance to a Roman peristyle. I remember walking its stone paths in the early morning, marveling at how the columns cast long, cooling shadows while birds nested quietly in the crevices. Was it a deliberate callback? Or had the stones remembered for us? Renaissance thinkers, enamored with antiquity, weren't just mimicking style. They were, in many cases, rediscovering practical genius. And yet, it's important to remember that these architects were working from fragments. Vitruvius had no diagrams. The Roman ruins were often partial, their functions obscured by time. So Renaissance builders had to infer, to interpret. And in doing so, they sometimes invented new traditions. Ones that felt ancient but were, in fact, part homage, part imagination. I always found that beautiful. The blend of memory and creativity. There's a moment I cherish. A letter from Michelangelo. Frustrated with a design commission. He wrote, "I wish I could ask the ancients directly. For the stones do not answer as easily as the living ones did." That line. The stones do not answer as easily. It reminds us that even when we uncover the past, we must listen carefully. We must respect the silences, the missing pieces. Still, the Renaissance gave us marvels. The Palazzo Farnese in Rome. The villas of Palladio near Vicenza. Ah! Palladio. Now he understood how to make a building breathe. His Villa Rotonda, with its perfect symmetry and open loggias, was more than a nod to Rome. It was a poem to air and space. He placed function at the heart of form, making sure each room caught just enough light and wind. When I taught Palladio to my students, I would always say, "Look at how he places the human at the center of the structure. Not by scale, but by comfort. And isn't that the true measure of thoughtful design?" Even beyond Italy, the ripple spread. Spanish architects borrowed Moorish cooling traditions, already descended from Roman ones, and merged them with Renaissance symmetry. In the gardens of the Alhambra, water ran not just for beauty but to refresh. In French shadows, wide corridors and shaded arcades appeared, speaking softly of their Mediterranean cousins. But perhaps what strikes me most is that despite the revival of Roman ideas, the modern notion of climate control still hadn't emerged in full. These designs were elegant responses to nature, not attempts to overpower it. And that, I think, is where the real wisdom lies. As cities expanded in the centuries that followed, and industrialization brought glass, steel, and electricity, we began to trade intuition for insulation. The windows stopped opening. The ceilings dropped. Air became something piped in, not danced with. And somehow, in all our progress, we grew less aware of how buildings could serve us with subtle grace. So the Renaissance, for all its brilliance, remains a hinge moment. A time when we remembered just enough to revive the conversation, but not yet enough to prevent its fading once more. But that conversation? It never really ends. Every time a modern architect sketches a shaded courtyard, or an urban planner aligns a street to the wind, they're joining a dialogue that began in Rome, was revived in Florence, and still echoes in the buildings we inhabit today. It's a quiet thread, but it holds strong. I often think about what our cities sound like. Not in the obvious way. Not the cars and trains and voices. I mean their breath. The way they exhale warmth on a summer evening, or whisper coolness just before dawn. The way light filters through the spaces we've created, or the stillness that lingers in shaded corners. In that way, ancient Rome still speaks. Softly. Through time. And more clearly than we might think. In modern architecture, we've become accustomed to comfort delivered by machines. Air conditioning is now a switch, not a strategy. And yet, as our cities face rising temperatures, energy burdens, and the clamor for sustainability, more and more architects are looking backward to move forward. You see, the wisdom of Roman cooling wasn't merely a matter of materials. It was a matter of mindset. Romans respected the environment as something to be read, negotiated with, designed around. Today, that's re-emerging under a different name. Passive design. Take the Eastgate Center in Harare, Zimbabwe. An office building inspired not by Rome, but by termite mounds. And yet, the principle is the same. Let air circulate naturally. Use mass, shade, water, and orientation. Keep the heat out, but let the light in. Similarly, in places like southern Spain and parts of southern California, architects are reintroducing porticos, loggias, and pergolas. The very vocabulary that once lined Roman villas and forum walkways. These features aren't quaint relics. They're functional adaptations, rediscovered through need. And I find that rather poetic. In Singapore, public housing incorporates breezeways between towers. In India, some schools are built with jali screens, perforated stone panels used by the Mughals, but also cousins to Roman latticework, which filtered both light and air. The line from Vitruvius to today may not be direct, but it is unbroken. There's also a rising awareness that green design must be more than cosmetic. Green roofs and vertical gardens are lovely. Yes. But true sustainability, like Roman design, begins at the blueprint. How does a building sit in its landscape? How does it behave when the sun is highest? Does it invite breezes or block them? And then there's the question of memory. Sometimes, when I walk through older neighborhoods, places built before modern HVAC, I notice something quietly ingenious. High ceilings, transom windows, deep verandas, thick masonry. All designed for air to move, not just people. These buildings, remember, they were built not just with stone and skill, but with patience. And often by those who had no luxury but to adapt wisely to climate. It makes me wonder, had we grown too far from that kind of knowing? Even with all our technology, we can still feel the difference between a room designed with the sun in mind and one slapped together by blueprints divorced from place. One invites you in like a shade tree. The other repels you like a car on a hot street. And I believe we're slowly learning again. Universities now teach climate adaptive design as part of sustainability. Cities launch competitions for passive homes. Museums host exhibitions on ancient architectural principles. Not as curiosities, but as templates. And as we face heat waves, energy shortages, and rising seas, we might just find that the Romans were never irrelevant, only waiting to be remembered. I recall a student of mine, brilliant girl, sharp as a tack, who once asked, "But why didn't they just invent air conditioning earlier?" I laughed, gently. "They didn't need to," I said. "They built with the air, not against it." She thought about that for a long time. And maybe we all should. Because in rediscovering these ideas, not just their mechanics, but their philosophies, we do something rather beautiful. We stitch ourselves back into a longer conversation. One that predates ducks and thermostats. A conversation between shelter and sun. Between stone and wind. Between need and elegance. When I open a window on a hot day, and feel a current of air curl into the room, I sometimes think of those Roman streets. Narrow. Shaded. Quiet. A jug of water on a windowsill. A linen curtain swaying softly. Children laughing in the peristyle. And above all, that sense of ease. Not luxury, but grace. We still have that choice. To build with intention. To listen to the seasons. To dwell not just in our cities, but with them. Because the future of comfort, it seems, may be written not in wires and machines, but in shadows, stone, and the breath of wind through a forgotten atrium. I remember one summer, perhaps 5 or 6 years ago now, when the heat was particularly cruel. The kind of heat that slows even your thoughts, makes the sidewalk shimmer, and the trees hum with exhaustion. I had retreated into my little study. Windows cracked just so. Curtains drawn. A fan chugging loyally in the corner. And I found myself returning, as I often do, to the pages of De Architectura. There was something comforting in Vitruvius's voice. Even across the centuries, he wrote with clarity and care, believing deeply that a building should serve both body and soul. That it should breathe with us. That it should, in his own words, be firm, useful, and delightful. I think of that often. Especially the last word. Delight. We don't usually associate temperature control with delight. We think in terms of efficiency, of cost, of tolerable levels. But the Romans, they knew how to make comfort beautiful. Think of a shaded colonnade. Polished marble cool beneath bare feet. The burble of a fountain echoing off stucco walls. The scent of damp earth in a peristyle garden. These weren't incidental luxuries. They were deliberate architectural choices, made to elevate daily life. In a world where unpredictability was a constant companion. Plague. Invasion. Famine. The home was a sanctuary. It had to soothe, shelter, and restore. And cooling was part of that design. As I close this chapter of our journey together, I'd like to leave you with an image. Imagine a Roman house at twilight. The day's heat has finally begun to lift. A woman. Perhaps a grandmother. Perhaps not unlike me. Sits near the open doorway. Her chair angled just so to catch the breeze that glides down the street. Behind her, a mosaic floor still holds the sun's memory. Somewhere in the garden, water glints in a basin carved long ago. Cicadas rasp softly. A child, barefoot, runs laughing through the atrium. And above it all, the stars begin to blink awake. That woman doesn't know that 2,000 years later, her home will be studied, marveled at, even mimicked. But she knows this. Her house keeps her cool. It keeps her safe. It allows her to rest. And isn't that what we all want, in the end? To build a space where the wind can find us. Where light enters kindly. Where the past hums gently in the walls. To remember that wisdom isn't always loud. Sometimes it whispers through stone and shadow. Through silence and shade. So tonight, dear listener, I hope you take that memory with you. Not just the facts or the names, but the feeling. The hush of a Roman room at dusk. The cleverness of design meeting the grace of nature. And the knowledge that long before us, people found ways to live well. Quietly. Wisely. And beautifully. And now, as the world outside your window quiets, and the day folds into memory, let your mind linger in those ancient spaces. Imagine the cool stone beneath your hand. The scent of laurel drifting through shaded gardens. The hush of an atrium waiting patiently for morning light. History, after all, is not just names and dates. It's texture, temperature, breath. The Romans built not just to impress, but to endure. To welcome the seasons, not fight them. To craft homes where comfort came not from force, but from thoughtful listening. To the earth, the sky, and the rhythms between. We, too, can learn to listen. So let the echoes of marble halls and murmuring fountains soothe you now. Let your thoughts drift like wind through a colonnade. And should sleep come, let it be soft, slow, and full of dreams shaped like arches, like gardens, like the quiet intelligence of a world that still speaks. If we take the time to hear it.